And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
Welcome, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo. It's great to be with you today on our Friday broadcast of this thing we call Hands-On Apologetics, where we learn how to explain, defend the faith with clarity, charity, and confidence. And it's great to be with you. You know, it's always a highlight to do this program because I love defending the faith, sharing the faith, and just learning more and more reasons why I should know and love Christ. You know, it's just, it builds up your faith, and it also enables you to help others who are struggling. Maybe, they're not really sure why they believe what they believe, and that's exactly what this apologetics does, is explains the whys, the sources, the reasons for what we believe as Catholics. And so, so it's always a shot in the arm. So thank you so much for joining us. Got a great show. Today's show, we're going to have the master apologist himself, Karl Keating, the guy who started off the modern apologetics movement in America. And he's going to be joining us. And we're going to continue in our series looking at Catholic apologetic classics. You know, there are these awesome books that were written, since the 1800s, turn of the last century, that are remarkable works of scholarship. They're fun to read, and they have very interesting backgrounds. But unfortunately, they're old. And let's face it, how many times do you end up in a seminary library browsing shelves? Well, for me, that's fairly common, but I think for everybody else, you don't even know about these classics. And so what Karl and I are trying to do through the series is to kind of bring to the public's attention that, there are these great books that deserve to be on your Catholic bookshelves. They're classics. And today's classic that we're going to look at has to do with the early church fathers and a very good patristic scholar named Father Joseph Tixeront, and specifically Tixeront's Patrology. And that's what we're going to talk about, this classic work, why you need to have it on your bookshelf, and why Catholics need to, have this available. It's yet another weapon for your war chest, so to speak, defending the faith war chest, and and that's why we're doing it. We're trying to let you know the good stuff and to stay away from some of the bad stuff as well. So these are solid gold classics with Karl Keating. He's going to be coming on the other side of the break. In the meantime, we're going to be working on fixing our critical thinking skills, honing them so that they're nice and sharp and can cut through a lot of the baloney that you hear, not only in religious dialogues, but also just everyday life. It's trying to think clearly about things is so important, now more than ever, because people aren't thinking clearly. And in fact, many people, including people you would be surprised, launch what's called fallacious arguments. And to help us find a fallacy, we have a Finding the Fallacy segment. Each episode we look at an informal fallacy. Even though it's Friday, we're going to do a fallacy because we actually missed one earlier this week. And that fallacy is the appeal to tradition. The appeal to tradition. This for defenders of faith out there, because it's not saying that sacred tradition or appealing to sacred tradition is fallacious, but I'll explain what it means when we get to that segment. Also, we have a great early church father that we are going to meet today. Who is it? Well, it's St. Leo I, also known as St. Leo, all right, the Great. Yes, you knew that. Pope St. Leo the Great. He reigned from 440 to 461. We'll talk about him, learn a little bit about his life. And in the meantime, let's jump to the Finding of the Fallacy. Oh, wait, before I do that, I want to say hi to everybody. I can't begin without my shout-outs. So first, let me give a shout out to all of you watching live stream on Facebook and YouTube. Hello, everybody. By the way, if you're on one of those platforms and it's 1:00, why don't you jump on board? You can see the live stream of the show. I'm sure it's a lot more exciting than the audio, and I mean that with completely tongue in cheek. Let's see. I also want to welcome all of you listening to radio around the country and around the world via podcast. And by the way, folks, I didn't mention this last program, but please, help with evangelism. You can, even though many of us are sequestered in our houses due to the flu, we can still evangelize, and we can do that by sharing about what we learn on these programs, and especially even sharing the programs themselves. So please, please, please. In your evangelism, let people know about Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Let them know about Hands-On Apologetics. Share it with your friends. Do those likes and bells. If you haven't subscribed to Hands-On Apologetics on YouTube, please do so, because that can ultimately help our ministry, and also it brings more attention to the program. All of those things are important because we want the rest of the world to know and love Jesus in his fullness in his church. So let's jump to the finding the fallacy for today. Finding the fallacy is the appeal to tradition. Appeal to tradition. What is it? Well, this fallacy occurs when somebody tries to use the fact that something has been done or accepted in the past as proof of the legitimacy for continuing to do so. Okay. For example, let me give you an example. We have been doing X for generations. Therefore, we should keep doing it. X. Okay. So, is this evidence is this a good reason, in other words? Is it simply because something is being done, has been done for generations, that it ought to continue? If that's all there is, okay, if that's all there is the only reason for continuing doing something is the fact that it has always been done, and nothing more, then you're committing the fallacy of the appeal to tradition. Okay, obviously there has to be reasons for it besides the fact that it's always been done. You can't just go with the status quo, right? Another formulation that sometimes is put forward is our ancestors thought X was right, therefore X is right. Well, just because something has always been thought to be right doesn't mean it necessarily is. It could be more refined, or they could be wrong. For example, there's aspects of Aristotle's physics that was long held to be correct in antiquity, but it turns out that it wasn't correct. Now, that being said, what about tradition and sacred tradition? Does that fall within this fallacy? Well, the thing is, if Jesus and the apostles hand on certain teachings, then those teachings should be held on and continue to be passed on through the ages. And there's nothing fallacious with claiming that you're the authentic church because you hold on to what was originally been given. Why? Because this is divine revelation. It's not subject to change, at least not essential change. We might be able to understand it clearer, and we might be able to apply that doctrine better in our lives in different circumstances as they present themselves. But in their essence, they never change. And so appealing to sacred tradition is not a fallacy. If anything, it's an argument for the truth, because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. So that is our finding the fallacy for today. Appeal to tradition. Why don't we jump to the Meet the Early Church Father? Like I said, he is a great early church father, St. Leo the Great, who was Pope, who reigned from AD 440 to 461. Pope St. Leo the Great was probably Tuscan in origin, although he called himself a Roman. Under Pope Sixtus III and Celestine before him, Leo was an archdeacon in the Diocese of Rome and was on official mission in Gaul, that is modern-day France, when he learned that Sixtus had died and that he himself was chosen to succeed to the See of Peter. Hastening back to Rome, he was consecrated on September 29th, 440 AD. The date of his death is uncertain, except that it's rather late in the year of 461. Leo is the first pope who did not die a martyr's death, and in 1754 he was declared a doctor of the church by Pope Benedict XIV. Now, Leo's reign was a burdensome one in that he was very well acquainted with, namely enduring the invasions of the Vandals and Huns from without, and also schisms and heresies from within. Chief among them was the Monophysite heresy, which believed that Christ had only one nature, not two, a kind of mixture of divine and human nature. And also the heresy of Eutyches as well, which is Trinitarian heresy. After the disgraceful procedure of the Robber Council of Ephesus, it was Leo who called that the meeting the famous quote, the Convention of Robbers, or the Robber Council, a name that stuck with it ever since. The Council of Chalcedon in 451 was expected to repair the situation, but it did, with a very clear condemnation both of Nestorianism and Monophysitism. And really quick, what are those two heresies, folks? Well, Nestorianism so wanted to separate the two natures of Christ that he almost divides them into two persons, where Monophysitism is the exact opposite, where they try to stress the unity between the two natures, that they actually conflate the two natures into like a mixture or of two substances, a third kind of nature, so to speak. And that is our early church father for today, Pope St. Leo the Great. Pope St. Leo, pray for us. Coming up on the other side of the break, Master Apologist Karl Keating. We're going to talk about Joseph Tixeront's Patrology. Stay tuned, folks.
Leviticus 11:44 says, "Consecrate yourselves and be holy, because I am holy." St. Vincent Pallotti said, "You must be holy in the way God asks you to be holy." God does not ask you to be a Trappist monk or a hermit. He wants you to sanctify the world and your everyday life. May God show us the path to holiness and help us to follow it all the days of our life.
Attention VMPR listeners. We've talked at length about the attack on our youth through popular culture media, but what if I told you there was someone trying to make a difference? The newest novel, Britfield and the Lost Crown, by C.R. Stewart, is reaching schools across America and sharing Christian morals alongside great storytelling. What if I told you that this mission needs your help? To reach more children, Britfield and the Lost Crown need funding for their ongoing book tour. If you're interested in making a difference, if you're interested in buying the book, or are curious and want more information, go to BritfieldInstitute.org. That's BRITFIELD Institute.org. Or email media@britfield.com. Help open up the world of Britfield and the Lost Crown to people everywhere.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show, and they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE, US 1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. And yeah, we're going to continue our series here on Catholic Apologetic Classics. You know, there's so many great books that solid research, well-written tomes, if you will, that of yesteryear that unfortunately have passed off people's radar screens, and they're collecting dust in libraries. And these books are so good that I think every Catholic ought to be familiar with them, if not have them on your apologetics bookshelf. And continuing our series on Catholic apologetic classics is master apologist himself, Karl Keating. Karl Keating, of course, is the founder of Catholic Answers. Nowadays, he's a full-time author. He's written over 16 books on Catholicism, fundamentalism, debating Catholicism series, Book for Life, No Apology, the list goes on and on. Karl writes at several genres, not just religion, but also literature, outdoors, self-publishing, and even fiction. And you can check out all the great stuff Karl has written at his website, which is karlkeating.com. And Karl, welcome to Hands On Apologetics.
Gary, it's great to be back with you as always. And we're going to have today, you used the word tome. We're going to have a triple tome today because the edition of the book that we're talking about that I have is in 3 fat volumes totaling 1,550 pages. So I think that qualifies as a tome.
Yes, and then some. That's quite a tome.
And, the book we're talking about, you want to introduce it?
Oh, no, actually, I was just going to ask you, what is our classic apologetic for today?
It's called The History of Dogmas by a French Sulpician priest who died in 1925 named Joseph Tixeront. The edition that I happen to have is 3 paperbacks published in 1984 by Christian Classics of Westminster, Maryland. It was a small Catholic publishing house that produced a lot of wonderful reprints, especially in the 1980s. It's long out of business. But so this is the edition I have. As I say, 1,550 pages of, standard size print, I guess. But, it's a substantial work. And there's an encomium by Father John Hardin on the back cover. And let me just read that, give you a little sense of the importance of the book. Okay. He said, "The history of dogmas is indispensable for all priests, religious, catechists, and laity concerned with an orthodox presentation of doctrinal questions. It is written in a smooth, easily readable style and has a wealth of information not available in any other contemporary publication." And that's really what this says. As the title pretty well says, the history of dogmas is a look at Catholic history in the first 8 centuries about how our distinctive dogmas developed and became better understood over time, particularly in the era of the patristic era, that is the era of the Fathers of the Church, which normally is considered to conclude about 749 with the death of St. John Damascene in the East, or concludes with the death of St. Augustine a couple centuries earlier in the West. Depends on how you want to measure the patristic age. But those early writers are the ones who worked out, thought through the dogmas of the Church. And so the author here has put together a wonderful, not patrology, not patristic study per se, but really a history of dogma by dogma. And it's a masterful work. It's one of those things that early on in my apologetical career, I spent a lot of time with, going through this and trying to understand how our beliefs came to be understood as they are.
Yeah. No. Was he the first to make a history of dogmas, or is this like part of a tradition of writing, of literature?
Oh, no, he's certainly not the first, but in modern times, he's probably been the best known, at least up to that point. This is almost a century ago now that he wrote this. And the style of book is one that probably has not been much replicated since his time. He actually wrote the book about 1904, these 3 volumes. And I'm not aware of anyone since that time, with the exception maybe of Ludwig Ott, with his book that we talked about in a previous show. I don't know of anybody who's attempted to do the same kind of thing in this way. This is really an historical study, and in certain ways, I think we can make a parallel to John Henry Newman, who was very much interested in Christian history, and of course, it was his very study of the development of early Christian doctrines that brought Newman into the Catholic Church. He was doing this study, writing a book that became his essay on development. And by the time he finished that book in 1845, he had studied himself, in a sense, historically into the Catholic Church, because he saw that the Catholic Church of his time in the 19th century was believing the same things that the early church of the first 8 centuries was believing.
Yeah, very good. And so, in some ways, it's kind of the flip side of another book we talked about, Cousins' was it Handbook of Heresies?
Handbook of Heresies, yes.
Yeah. Except it's the flip side is the Handbook of Orthodoxy.
That's right. Yeah. Handbook of Orthodoxy, Handbook of Unorthodoxy. We have, of course, Tixeront in these 3 fat volumes, he does talk about the heresies that came up. The Teresa Cousins book was a very thin book. It's only about maybe 6% of the length of these 3 volumes. Right. And maybe our listeners will recall that Frank Sheed praised her highly. In fact, she wrote her thin book in the apartment where Frank Sheed and his wife Maisie Ward lived, because Louisa Cousins had no place to write on her own. She was a washerwoman. She scrubbed floors for a living. And so she used their kitchen table as a place to write her book. And she had mentioned that she had the most subtle theological mind that he had ever met, even though she had no formal education in theology. But her book was looking at the heresies that came up through the centuries, from the earliest times all the way through the Reformation and past that. Whereas the books under consideration today look at all those, at least the early heresies, of course, in the first 8 centuries. But these books are really looking at how the authentic doctrine developed. And often it developed in contradistinction to the heresies. The heresy would come up and get something wrong, and the church and theologians would have to straighten things out. And it was often a long process involving councils, and sometimes decades or even centuries before things got ironed out completely. And so Tixeront in these 3 books, The History of Dogmas, gets that story, where Louisa Cousins, of course, was much shorter. Her purpose was different.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so in a way, he kind of encompasses the heresies that she brought up, plus, how the church dealt with those heresies, and it ultimately led to the clarification of doctrine.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that some people will say, well, how come on day 1 of the church, say at Pentecost, maybe day 2 or the day after, the apostles just didn't sit down and write out all the dogmas of the church in one fat book, super catechism, to start things off? Right. It's a good question, and we don't exactly know why God willed it the way he did, but the way he willed it was for the church to come to a deeper understanding of church teachings over a long period of time, and through adversity, through confusions and actually heresies and disputes and so on. And it was through this process that things became clarified. And so that's the kind of story that these books, these 3 volumes, are telling, as the author walks us through the early history of the church in light of the church's beliefs. Yeah,
very good. Yeah, one thing that struck me with Tixeront's treatment is how orthodoxy is always the great balance. It seems like heresies tend to split into opposite extremes. In fact, today we were talking about Nestorianism and Monophysitism, 2 diametrically opposed heresies. And, the Orthodox position's pretty much down the middle on those positions.
Yeah, there's an interesting problem as in early times as to, whether Christ had one will or 2 wills, or whether he had one nature or 2 natures. And with respect to the latter, the great heresies of the time, one said, oh, he has one nature, the human only. And the other said, no, he's got one nature, the divine only. So they both rose from the same principle, the wrong principle that Christ could have but one nature. But the church's answer was, no, he's got two natures.
Yeah.
So you guys are each taking a wrong principle, and one of you takes it this way, the other takes it that way. You become arch enemies, but you're both wrong.
Right. Yeah, it's odd, and it just seems to be repeated over and over through church history, where there will be a wrong action and then an equal and opposite wrong reaction, and it takes the church to kind of reel both into what exactly is the correct understanding.
And that's a very human kind of thing, though, because if we look in other areas of life, whether it's in architecture or literary criticism or politics, we see the same kind of thing. Going off to one extreme, and then that's perceived as wrong, and the opposition goes off too far in the other extreme. So it's not splitting the difference. It's finding what the truth is, and the truth may have elements from either side, but the truth is the truth, and it doesn't go off on some, fanciful journey to one end or the other. And so, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. When the church makes a decision between opposing errors, it's not trying to we'll give 50% of the credit here and 50% there, and that's what our solution will be. No.
Yeah, right.
It identifies the wrong things at each end, which normally will end up being perceived by many people as being somewhere in the middle.
Right. Yeah, very good. Yeah, it's because it's fun. Humans are funny creatures, aren't they? We often we often want to defend the faith by sometimes going to the opposite error, and where instead you should always be affirming the truth.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not so much a matter of going to an opposite error, but giving a false emphasis to something. And when you give a false emphasis to something that even may be true, you can end up giving insufficient emphasis to something else that's equally true, and that also should be kept in mind to the same degree. And that more often is really what happens. So you've got good people who are trying to oppose an error, but some will go off this way and emphasize this true point. Others will go off that way, another true point. And yet, even though those groups may maintain true thinking, what happens is that they end up with a false emphasis. And the problem with the false emphasis is something that we'll talk about after the break.
Yeah, very good. We're chatting with Karl Keating about apologetic classics, and today's classic is Tixeront, History of Dogma. Stay tuned, folks. More to come on the other side of the break.
Christ's message of love, mercy, and compassion is for all of humanity. The Last Days, the Passion and Death of Jesus the Christ, is a live passion play being performed in Los Angeles and is an opportunity to get up close and personal to Jesus Christ during this season of Lent. Hi, I'm Jonathan Rumi, and I play Jesus Christ, and I'd like to invite you to join us on April 4th, 5th, and Good Friday, April 10th, at Emmanuel Presbyterian Church in Koreatown for this special presentation. If you're not able to attend the play in person, please consider supporting the ministry by making a donation to help us ensure Christ's message is brought to the world through the arts. For more information, again, go to www.thelastdayspassionplay.com and find, follow, and share us on social media, on Instagram @The Last Days of Jesus, and on Facebook @The Last Days of Jesus Passion Play. Thank you so much, and God bless.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And here's an easy way to support us by going to smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center or Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And when you log in your Amazon account and you purchase products, a portion of it will go right back in supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And it doesn't cost you a dime. I want to thank you ahead of time
because that supports us year-round. May God bless you and your family.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Karl Keating about the classic work, Tixeront's History of Dogma. And right before the break, Karl was mentioning that, how heresies tend to overemphasize things to the neglect of other truths. And, Karl, if you want to pick it up from there.
Yeah. What I was saying is that also truths themselves can be overemphasized. Oftentimes when someone is trying to oppose an error, even if the error hasn't gotten to the point of actually being called a heresy, but a person can so emphasize a particular true point and build his faith around that he neglects other true points, particularly ones that it seemed that heresy was favoring in addition to its heretical ideas. So if you've got, say, true points A and B, and the heresy's teaching C, but also talks a lot about B, someone endorsing or wanting to emphasize A may end up neglecting B, which is also a true point. And so if you end up too much emphasizing this one aspect of the faith or this one dogma, what you end up unfortunately doing, maybe certainly by indirection or imprecision, is you, in other people's minds, give a false representation of the faith, and that could lead them into error. Because I mentioned the A and B as both being true elements, and one could be overemphasized, but someone could end up letting B drop from his consciousness entirely and ends up with a faith that just composed of A, so to speak. And so a false emphasis, not taking into account all Catholic dogmas, a false emphasis focusing just on one or two, what have you, your favorites, could end up leading other people astray. And then, and they end up in heresy D down the road. So it's a complicated thing. So the church always tries to have this balance. There's taking everything that's true into account, sifting through what may be true elements within a heretic's propositions or presentation, but also trying to purge out from that the false stuff that makes whatever this person is saying heretical. So it's a complicated process, which is a reason why the church took the first 3/4 of a millennium to basically fine-tune its beliefs, so that really after that, you might say, well over 90% of everything we believe was worked out by that point. There were still things to do. For example, the Middle Ages, transubstantiation, came under attack. And that didn't happen until the Middle Ages, actually. And so it was with Berengarius of Tours. And so it wasn't until the Middle Ages that the church worked through definitively our understanding of the real presence. And then some Marian doctrines later and so on. But most of what Catholics believe was worked out through these controversies of the first 7 or 8 centuries.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, it's so Tixeront's History of Dogmas. Is there what's the internal structure of these books? Is it like an outline, like Ott's work, or is it more of a read, like a novel?
Well, I don't know if I would quite call it a novel, because it doesn't quite have the plot and character development that we would expect.
Yeah, sure.
But
right.
There is a storyline. The books are basically arranged chronologically. The first of the 3 volumes is called the Ante-Nicene Theology. That is, the way things were developed before the Council of Nicaea in 325. Then the second volume goes from St. Athanasius to St. Augustine, who died in 430. And then the third volume, called The End of the Patristic Age, goes from that time to about the year 800. So Tixeront takes this all very much chronologically and shows what comes up, what problems come up, and what things are taught at any particular period. And naturally, you're going to have things that overlap time-wise. For example, the Arian heresy, which taught that Christ had only a human nature, not a divine nature, and therefore that he was the most excellent of all creatures, but still just a creature. And God the Father worked through his creature, Jesus Christ, to create the world and so on. But nevertheless, Christ was not himself divine. So that was the chief ancient heresy. It lasted for centuries, So the church would come out and have councils that would define the true teaching. But still, there's a point where most of the bishops in the world, numerically speaking, subscribe to the Arian heresy. Nothing. We've never had a defection of the episcopate like that since. And just as a tail to that, it was largely because of the bad effects that this heresy had within the people in the church that made the church so weak, Christianity so weak, that when Islam overran North Africa in the 7th century, Christianity just fell apart, and the whole of North Africa became Muslim. Because, if you want Christianity to be strong against adversity, it's got to be a true Christianity, not something riddled with a fundamental error, as Arianism was. So Arianism was a big error, but like I say, it lasted for centuries. So therefore, in the history of dogmas, the author is going back, repeatedly to talk about the status of, of that heresy and other things, century by century. So he does look at things chapter by chapter is pretty much in an overarching way, but he doesn't try to put into one chapter, 3 centuries worth of the situation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Yeah. That's one thing that really comes through in this book is people tend to think, well, the church council meets, they decide, and then the heresy disappears. When actually, it's just the heresy usually becomes just more subtle, and tries to sneak by on changing its language.
Yes, and it will come back often in later centuries with a different guise, a different name. I mean, Arianism itself is a good example. That seemed to be pretty well wiped out by, let's say, the year 600. Okay, and then Arianism was not a problem for centuries after that until our own time. Now, when you talk with a lot of people, especially non-Catholic Christians, and you ask about, who Jesus was, the answer they really give is basically a variant of Arianism. He was the most perfect of all men, and we should follow his example, and so on and so forth. But they're not really saying he's God, literally God, okay, plus being man, okay. So you've got sort of a weakly thought through Arianism of today, where the Arianism of the ancient times was really a philosophy and theology that was very robust and very manly and very much thought through by its promoters, who would love to argue their position. You don't find the equivalent today, but you do find, basically by default, the equivalent position taken by people now that we live in a time that most people don't think theologically at all. They emote rather than use their mind in trying to deal with their faith. And so they've sort of fallen into what's the equivalent of Arianism.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. And it's funny how these ancient heresies kind of bubble up today, in different forms. I think, was it R.C. Sproul? I probably shouldn't bring it up because I'm not sure the name. But someone who said that God it's wrong to say God suffered on the cross. It was just his humanity that suffered, which was almost like an Nestorian belief.
Yes, because you're dividing Christ. How many persons suffer on the cross? Well, there's only one person, which is the divine person in Christ. But if you're saying, in essence, that one person suffered, the human, and the other person, the divine, didn't, then you've got a heresy, because you're saying Christ really has but one. There's only one person, the human, and you're falling into that kind of trap. Now, I don't know if R.C. Sproul said that. He was a Protestant, evangelical theologian.
Yeah.
But you run into those kinds of problems, and even very intelligent people such as he and others, Protestant scholars that I've read, recent ones, those who have been writing the last, say, 30, 40 years, you'll often find them, curiously, falling into language that very much suggests an unconscious adoption of an ancient error, though they don't really see it.
Yeah. So, that underscores right there the reason why this, Catholic apologetic classic is important to read, because it arms you with the knowledge to pick out these subtle heresies that seem to just keep bubbling up in popular media and, religious dialogue.
Yeah, this is one of the problems that Catholics and Protestants have in modern times, is that we're not remotely as rigorous in our thinking as our forebears had been. Mm-hmm. If you look even at, say Newman's work, it's only a century and a half ago. You read it through, he's very easy to read. His English is wonderful English. But his thought is very deep, and his arguments are really well thought out. But they take energy, they take effort to go through and to understand. We're so accustomed to being given conclusions and not having to think through how those conclusions were reached, that when we read somebody like Newman or Tixeront here, and we see the development not only of doctrine, but the development of the argument for the doctrines, and we follow them through, it's like if you don't have much of a math background and you're shown a conclusion to a formula, say, okay, I'll accept that. Looks okay to me. But if you have to actually work it through, it becomes complex, and you have to exert yourself to follow it through. And, that could be troublesome.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're chatting with Karl Keating about Tixeront's History of Dogma. Stay tuned, folks. More to come on the other side of the break. You're listening to Hands On Apologetics. We'll be right back.
Help the Helpless, a Minnesota St. Paul nonprofit organization chaired by Father of Tyr and volunteers, is humbly asking you for your kind support to help the poor and the handicapped children in India and Ecuador. Through financial support from the Help of the Helpless benefactors, the children are provided with clothing, food, education, shelter, and the teachings of the Catholic Church. The mission is to help children thrive and become self-sufficient young adults leading productive lives. We also provide aid to poor families in Ecuador with food baskets, medicines, medical assistance, and help with funeral needs for the deceased. The work in India is done by Father Antonio's organization, St. Mary's. In Ecuador, the work is being done by the Servant Sisters of the Home of Mother. You can call us at 877-762-8857. To learn more, please visit our website, www.helpthehelpless.org. God bless you.
In 1 Corinthians 13:13, St. Paul says, "So there abide faith, hope, and love, these three." According to St. Ignatius of Antioch, faith is the beginning and love is the end, and God is the two of them brought into unity. Then comes everything else that makes up a Christian. May God grant that we may attain all the virtues that make for authentic followers of His Son.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Karl Keating about Tixeront's history of dogma. And Karl, you know, I'm curious because I'm a nerd. So if I bought this set of books, like you said, 3 volumes, 1,500 or so pages, I would put that on my nightstand and just work through it. But yeah, I'm just curious, when you got these books, earlier in your apologetics career, how did you use them? Was it just a reference work, or did you make it a course to read sections of it? How did you tackle it?
Well, I actually read it straight through because it's that kind of book. Unlike Ludwig Ott's book, which is truly an outline. This is not an outline. This is in chapters with standard prose. I read it straight through, all 3 volumes. I don't remember now how long it took me. But I have those volumes still in front of me, and I see that I made some marginal notations every few pages. And then later on, once I'd gone through the books, and I would be maybe composing some tract or article or book of my own, I would dip back into these to refresh myself on the particular issue and to get, the author's perspective, and then that'd be very helpful. But originally I simply sat down and read them straight through. I found them fascinating. And at the same time I was reading a parallel set on Patrology, which was, I think, a 4-volume set by a different author. And there was a parallel between the two. Patrology is the study of the fathers of the church. You can see, pater in the word patrology. And patristics is a study of the teaching of the fathers of the church. And so there's a great overlap with patristics in particular with what Tixeront has in these 3 books, because in the first several centuries, those Christian writers were the fathers of the church, chiefly. But of course, he also looks at the heretics and others there who obviously were not fathers of the church. But so my use, I first went through them straight, and then I would come back periodically to them. Although I have to say it's been quite some time since I've looked at the books, and I'm very happy that you proposed today that we look at these, because it gave me an excuse to get them off the shelf again.
Yeah, they're great. You know what? For me, and maybe you can kind of comment on this, it's a lot easier for me to picture where the early church fathers are when the heresies occur and the history that's going on at the same time. It's like when you read something like this work, you can kind of see, okay, well, this early father was at this time, this was going on in history, and here's the error that they've been addressing. And it's a lot easier to kind of get a bird's eye view of dogmatic history that way.
Yes, because also there are things going on in the secular world at the same time, and there's often a connection between the two, because you might have, for example, an emperor or king or what have you, himself falling into a heresy and taking his people in that direction. And that, in fact, might be the excuse the church has to get involved and to call a council to straighten things out. And then you've got a conflict between that secular ruler and the popes and so on and so forth. So it's really all interconnected naturally, because the church isn't just isolated theologians in some monasteries. It's the people, chiefly.
Yeah, right.
And they're the ones who either adopt the right faith or adopt a skewed faith or adopt an outright heresy or what have you. So you got all that working together. So this book, this 3-volume set, is very much useful to get a wider view of everything going on in the church at the time. I mean, it's not an emphasis of the secular episode so much, but those are necessarily brought in because the secular authorities are often people who are involved pro and con in the way church teachings end up getting understood. By the way, like during the break, I took a look at Amazon, and I discovered that the History of Dogmas is available in paperback and hardback and as a Kindle ebook, the 3 volumes recently redone. It's really a reprint of exactly what I have in front of me. And the hardbacks go for about, they reach differently in price because the books are different thicknesses, but they average about $30 a piece, which isn't bad. The paperbacks about $18 a piece. And the Kindle ebooks, 99 cents a piece. So if you want to get the 3 of them on your Kindle device or a comparable device, or even on your desktop, and you can use the Kindle Reader on your desktop to read them, you can get all 3 volumes for $3. Pretty good deal.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, actually, I'm kind of shocked that the hardcover's that cheap. I was expecting you to say about $50 or $60 because those are pretty thick volumes.
Well, when you got 500 plus pages per book, $30 is pretty good. And so now they haven't been retyped. So, like I said, they were photo reproductions, but a lot of books, old books are reproduced nowadays that way, and they're available through Amazon. So I'm presuming, I haven't looked inside them, of course, but I'm presuming that they're as legible as the ones I have here, since they're just photo reproductions. But $30 for hardback is great. $18 or so for a paperback, still a good price for a 500-page book.
Yeah, absolutely. Since you brought it up, this is kind of a sidetrack, but I'd love to hear your input on it. What do you think is superior, having a book in print or looking at through electronic media like Kindle or something like that?
There are advantages to either one. In my own case, I like to make marginal notations in books that I'm reading. I have a little system of vertical lines I put in the margin that mean certain things to me. Okay, I only put in pencil. I never write over the text itself, and that's a convenient way for me to go back to a book later like these, and I can easily flip through and see what I had highlighted as being important or really important, or wrong-headed sometimes depending on the book. You can't do that as conveniently, I think, with an ebook. On the other hand, an ebook is something you can have on your phone or your laptop and whip it out anytime. You could be in a plane or train trip and be reading, on your phone, and that's great. Different books lend themselves to different ways. It's probably easier on your phone to be reading a novel than a theological work like this, of course, because it's got footnotes and all that stuff. Right. But there are pluses to each. So in my own books, for example, I have them come out both ways because there are some people who prefer one form, others who prefer the other. And I myself, for some books, I prefer the electronic version. It's more practical for whatever that purpose might be. And for others, I might prefer the print version.
Right. Yeah. I agree. I mean, it's they each have pluses and minuses. The nice thing about the Kindle is if you're going to an apologetics discussion or you're coming from it and you're trying to remember, what was it that Tixeront said about, the Monophysites or something? All you have to do is pull out your Kindle and, you have instant access to it, where you have to wait till you get all the way home before you get the volumes.
Yeah, and again, it doesn't have to be any more Kindle device, which I've got one of those. You can get it on your phone, with the Kindle Reading app, which is free. So I've got any number of books on the phone that I'm speaking into at the moment. And, I can pull it out, and I can search in there for a term or whatnot, or maybe I've highlighted some text, which is the equivalent of my marginal notations, and I can go right to that. So it's very convenient. And, as you know, I like to go backpacking and this kind of stuff. I'm not going to take a 500-page book with me.
Right.
Throw that in my pack. I'm taking my phone anyway because it's got my GPS on it, so I know where I am. But, so for no extra weight, I've got the books right there to occupy my evening in the tent,
Yeah.
So when you have that kind of convenience, even tomes going back to that word from the top of the hour. Even tomes like Tixeront's History of Dogmas, something you can have with you really at any time and just dip into and profit from. A lot of people commute to work, train, or what have you, and they could be on the bus and they've got 15 minutes. You'll hold your phone in front of your face and read a few pages from Tixeront. Why not?
Yeah, exactly. And such enrichment, to be able to utilize that spare time to read some really good scholarship. And the other cool thing about this multi-volume set is the footnotes, because he accesses a lot of sources that are only available in Latin. So unless you're a Latinist, it'd be hard for you to access some of the things he uses.
That's right, because a lot of the works that he's referring to, I'm looking at a few pages now with half a dozen footnotes, each going to a Latin text. A lot of those are simply not available in translation, period.
Yeah.
So unless you're good at Latin, you would never have been able to track those down. And he provides, he gives you the citations, but then he will draw quotations out in this case into English. Of course, he wrote in French, but it's translated, and it's a great convenience. So he does a lot of homework for you. So if you were serious about wanting to know, the earliest writings about these things, and those would all be in Greek or Latin, of course, back in those centuries. And if you're not fluent in those languages, you're still able to get the gist of them, or more than the gist, by going to this set of books, because he lays it all out for you.
Right. Yeah, and that's incredibly helpful. Incredibly helpful. Well, Karl, I can't believe that the hour has just flown. Any new works that are going to be coming to press soon?
Well, I think I mentioned this one before. I've got a book which is a travelogue about my journey along the way of St. Benedict in Italy, which I walked last May. And that book is basically done. The title is Sun, Storm, and Solitude, Discovering Hidden Italy on the Camino di San Benedetto. The text is all done. The coverage is about done. But unfortunately, this is not the best moment to bring out a travelogue about Italy. So I'm going to be delaying that a little bit.
That's so
until
true.
we'll push this time. Okay. So, but that's going to be my next one that will show up. And I'm really looking forward to it, because it's a different kind of book for me. I think it will appeal to a wide audience beyond the Catholic audience, and but it's also got a lot of Catholic stuff in it. So Sun, Storm, and Solitude will come out in a few months.
Very good. I'm looking forward to picking that book up, because you've talked about it a couple of shows, and it sounds fascinating. And who knows, that might be the only place in Italy that would be safe to travel, would be along the way.
Yeah, but you can't get there now, so we'll have to wait.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, Karl, thank you so much for coming on the program. We really appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Gary. Thanks.
All right. Karl Keating, ladies and gentlemen. Check out his stuff at karlkeating.com. Lots of great books, and such a privilege to have him on. Coming up next, the Terry and Jesse Show. High-impact Catholic talk coming at you. And, it's time for me to shut down the Midwest Command Center here, turn off the dojo lights. Thank you so much for listening, folks. And, God willing, we will talk again next Monday. Bye-bye, everybody.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church, so I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold. for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
I'm a soldier.